It is the night before launch, and your phone will not stop ringing. You work for Morton Thiokol, the contractor that built the solid rocket boosters. Strapped to the side of the shuttle stack, sitting on the pad at Kennedy Space Center. The temperature at the Cape is dropping toward the 20s, colder than any previous shuttle launch. Your data on the rubber O-rings that seal each booster segment says cold makes them stiff. Stiff rings seal slower. A slow seal lets hot gas escape, even for a fraction of a second. You know this because you have seen it before. On a flight 10 months earlier, when temperatures were unusually low, and recovered booster segments showed scorched O-ring material. You wrote a memo about it. Engineer Roger Boisjoly wrote a sharper one, warning that flying outside the tested temperature range risked, in his words, a catastrophe of the highest order. Tonight, on a conference call between Thiokol and NASA managers, you and your colleagues recommend delaying the launch until the weather warms. NASA pushes back. The shuttle has flown 24 times. Some of those flights had O-ring erosion too. And nothing failed catastrophically. A manager on the call asks if Thiokol is trying to generate new launch criteria the night before liftoff. Eventually, Thiokol's management caucuses privately, away from NASA's ears, and reverses its own engineers. The launch is approved, documented by the Rogers Commission, the presidential panel that investigated the disaster afterward. This was not a single bad decision. It was a sequence of normalized risks, each one surviving because the last one had. Now picture the version of that night where the recommendation holds instead of folding. Imagine Thiokol's engineers do not back down. Imagine the launch slips by a day, then two, until the Florida morning warms past the freezing line your own data demanded. No catastrophic O-ring failure happens, because the rings never get cold enough to fail. The 7 astronauts aboard, including Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher chosen for the Teacher in Space program, fly safely to orbit on a warmer morning. This is the counterfactual. It is worth sitting with, because the difference between that outcome and the one history actually recorded was measured in temperature and time. Not in physics. Anyone misunderstood what actually happened on January 28, 1986, is now one of the most thoroughly documented engineering failures in American history. 73 seconds after liftoff, hot gas breached the right solid rocket booster's aft field joint. The flame plume burned through a strut connecting the booster to the external fuel tank. The tank ruptured. The orbiter broke apart under aerodynamic forces at roughly 46,000 feet. All 7 crew members were lost. NASA's own accident investigation, along with the Rogers Commission report released later that year, traced the failure to that single O-ring joint, the same joint Boisjoly had flagged in writing months earlier. Physicist Richard Feynman, serving on the Rogers Commission, demonstrated the core problem live during a televised hearing. He took a sample of O-ring material, clamped it, and dropped it into a glass of ice water. After a few seconds, he pulled it out and showed the panel that the rubber no longer sprang back to its original shape. Cold rubber loses resilience. A solid rocket booster joint depends on that resilience to seal the gap between segments at the moment of ignition, when pressure spikes hardest. Feynman's small experiment translated months of internal memos into something every viewer at home could see for themselves. So let's reconstruct the moment that mattered most. Not the explosion itself, but the conference call 8 hours before launch. On one side sit the Thiokol engineers. Looking at the chart, of every previous flight's O-ring erosion plotted against launch temperature. The coldest prior launch, at 53 degrees, already showed erosion. Tonight's forecast calls for the 20s. The trend line, to them, only points one direction. On the other side sit NASA managers under pressure from a launch schedule that had already slipped multiple times that month, with the sitting president expected to mention the teacher in space mission in his State of the Union address the following evening. Sociologist Diane Bohan, who spent years studying NASA's internal culture after the disaster, described this pattern as the normalization of deviance. Each flight that survived a known flaw made that flaw look less like a warning and more like an acceptable quirk of the hardware. Risk did not disappear. It just stopped registering as risk. Here is the counterintuitive part. The piece most retellings skip entirely. The O-ring problem was never a secret discovered too late. It was known, documented, and escalated through the proper channels by the engineers responsible for it. The catastrophic failure was not a flaw in the science. It was a flaw in how clearly documented risk got overruled by schedule pressure, and a culture that had grown comfortable treating near misses as proof of safety rather than warnings of failure. If you wanted to prevent this disaster, you did not need a new sensor or a redesigned joint. You needed someone with the authority to delay launch, to weigh that one piece of paper as heavily as it deserved. This matters now because the fix that came out of Challenger was not just an engineering fix. NASA redesigned the booster joints, adding a third O-ring and heaters to keep the seals warm regardless of outside air temperature. But the agency also restructured how dissenting engineering opinions reach decision makers, building in a path for safety concerns to escalate past program managers without first being filtered or softened. That same structural question, whether a warning from the people closest to the hardware reaches the people with the authority to stop a countdown, still shapes how commercial spaceflight companies run their own launch readiness reviews today. SpaceX, Boeing, and every other current launch provider builds formal dissent channels into their flight readiness process. Specifically because of what happened on that conference call in January 1986, Krista McAuliffe was meant to teach two lessons from orbit to classrooms across the country. Millions of schoolchildren were watching the launch live for exactly that reason. The mission's goal, to make spaceflight feel ordinary and accessible, is part of why its loss landed so hard. It did not look like a daring test flight. It looked like a teacher going to work. If the recommendation from Theocol's own engineers had held that night, there would be no Rogers Commission, no televised ice water demonstration, no redesigned joint with a third O-ring and internal heaters. There would likely be a shuttle that launched 2 or 3 days later than planned, on a forecast a few degrees warmer, carrying its crew home the way every other shuttle mission before and after it eventually did. The technology was not the obstacle. The will to listen to the data already in hand was. Your oxygen gauge does not run out in this story. The countdown clock does. And the question it leaves behind is not whether the warning existed, but whether anyone with the power to stop the clock was willing to hear it in time.